Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you could join me for this final installment of our series, Winning the Race. Many of you have told me that you've appreciated this, and I'm grateful. I want you to know that we are going to be changing the format of what we do in the midweek beginning next week. Instead of putting these weekly installments onto our YouTube channel, we're going to change and have a Zoom Bible class. A Zoom Bible class basically uses the platform Zoom online, and it allows us to join together from our computer using our cameras and having in-person class. We're able to interact, we're able to ask questions. Many of you have joined me for our Zoom class on Sunday evenings, and you have told me how much it's meant to you and how effective you think that it is. So we're going to be changing what we do on Wednesday nights and going to a Zoom format. I hope you'll join me. If you'd like to know what it means to join me for a Zoom class, you can email me. You can email me at the church email address, salisaokchurchofchrist@gmail.com. Again, all one word, all lowercase, salisaokchurchofchrist@gmail.com. Spell it all out. Long email address, but it's effective. And it's pretty easy to remember. Write me your intentions or your desires, and I'll be glad to communicate with you. You can also text me or call me. My phone number is 623-213-4611. Again, 623-213-4611. I hope you'll join me for the Zoom class next week, and I look forward to spending time with you on a personal level as we study the scriptures together. And you don't have to be a member of the Salisaw Church to join us. Anyone can participate. Let's pray together. Lord, I bow to you now, giving you praise for your grace, for the way that you work in our lives, for the way that you change us and mold us and use us. But Lord, if we resist that and if we push you away, then help us to see how we can nullify that grace if we don't watch out, if we try to justify ourselves by our own power. I pray that the scriptures will be clear to us on this today and that you'll help me to be able to communicate well. I'm not trying to alienate a soul. I really want this to be your word and not mine. So please help. Help me to teach and preach this as I should. And let us have a great class tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I want to begin by telling you a little story from my middle school days. In the 8th grade, I had to take Texas history. Everybody in Texas has to take Texas history during middle school. It seems to be a rule. And so I took Texas history, and my teacher was a man by the name of Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal was really one of my favorite teachers. But one day he comes storming into the room like he was mad at the world, and he yells at us for being too lackadaisical in our approach to study and told us that we were doing poorly in our testing. And to drive home his point, he pulls out a pop quiz that has 35 questions on it, and he passes it out to the whole class. He told us that none of us could talk, and if anyone did, they would get a 0 on the test. And he didn't say another word, but he sat down with a hum. And he did say one more thing, I'm sorry. He said, follow the instructions on the test to the letter. The instruction for the test was on the first line under the words pop quiz. And the instruction was roughly this: review every question on this quiz before beginning the test. Well, I was ADD, and I didn't read anything to the end before I jumped into it, so I just started answering questions. And I started answering questions about the Alamo and Davy Crockett, how many were at the Battle of San Jacinto, and so on. And I did great, I thought, until I got to number 35 on the test. And number 35, the item said this: disregard the other 34 questions on this pop quiz, sign your name, and turn in your paper on the box on Mr. Neal's desk. I failed the easiest test I ever took in my school years. And the reason why I failed the test is that I ignored the grace of the teacher by giving us the easiest test in the world. And I ignored the instructions of the test because I was impatient and because I thought I knew everything. It's a problem, when you think you know everything. Over the past few weeks, we have been studying 1 Corinthians chapters 9 and 10, and we've read Paul's encouragement to a church that had lost a lot of the perspective of what it meant to be a child of God. Paul's teachings to this church had preceded the letter, and other preachers and teachers had shared with them God's will and God's word. But this group of people were like so many in my 8th grade class, including myself. They had a test in front of them, and there was only one answer, but they couldn't seem to take the test without messing things up. Listen to what Paul tells them in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Salvation had come to these people, and they didn't have to do anything but accept the grace of Jesus Christ that came through his death, his burial, and his resurrection. These Christians had heard the good news about Jesus Christ, and they had admitted their need for Jesus' salvation given to them. And they had also admitted, at least at one time, their inability to do enough good in their lives so that they could somehow become their own savior. The plain message of the sufficiency of Jesus' sacrifice and their need to accept it was well known to these Christians. It was the basis of what they taught and preached and believed. But the way Paul writes to them in 1 Corinthians chapters 9 and 10, why were these people seemingly having so many problems running this race? Well, I believe that most of the problems that the Corinthians were having can be boiled down to a simple equation. They needed to learn that salvation minus sanctification equals disqualification. Now, I know some of you are going to jerk back and say, wait a minute, I don't know if that's right. Well, listen to what Paul says to them in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. So I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Listen, I know that the word sanctification is one that we don't use every day. Sounds like a churchy word, probably most often used when talking about the Bible. But sanctification is a very important word for all believers in Christ to understand. In its most basic meaning, sanctification refers to those things which you set aside for special use. One of the greatest examples I've found is that it's like that fine china you have sitting in that cabinet over in the dining room or the kitchen. At least many of us have. Or you may have it in the pantry. You have it so that you can break it out on the most special occasions. And why do you do that? It's because you have assigned to that set of dishes a high value Maybe it's sentimental value. Maybe it was owned by your mother or your grandmother or your great grandmother. But you have made the decision, if you're like us, that when you have a very, very special event, you're going to take that and you're going to put it before your guest because it shows the importance of an honorable occasion. You see, the assigning of value is important to God. And God, I believe, chooses to assign each one of us a value. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm more valuable than you or you're more valuable than me. But it means that what I'm doing and how I live my life is meant to be valuable for God in His service. You see, in the same way, those who are sanctified by God are those people that God has set aside for His use. By the way, another term in Scripture for being set aside is to be made holy. In another letter to the church, to a church, Paul writes to the church in Thessalonica in the book of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 13 through 15, and he shares with them some very similar principles. He says to them, "But we ought always to thank God for you, brothers, loved by the Lord, because from the beginning God chose you to be saved through the sanctifying work of the Spirit and through belief in the truth. He called you to this through our gospel, that you might share in the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the teachings we passed on to you, whether by word of mouth or by the letter." The Thessalonians and the Corinthians both got the principle. Jesus saves. There's no doubt that's true, and there's no doubt that they leaned into that. But they weren't grasping the standing firm part, or at least they didn't seem to be. We know this because when we read in Paul's letters, we read about several critical issues, especially in the fellowship of the Corinthians, that Paul felt like he needed to address. They had been choosing favorite teachers to follow. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ. And they had become competing philosophies within the church. They decided to emphasize some gifts as having higher value than others. They were the ones making the assignment of the value. I speak in tongues. I interpret tongues. I have the gift of prophecy. I have the gift of healing. Mine's more valuable than yours. They had come together to practice the Lord's Supper, but they had allowed things like gluttony and drunkenness and abuse of the poor to come into this holy expression of faith and thanks for what Jesus Christ had done for them. I have no doubt that these Corinthians were believing that Jesus had done all the work so that they don't have to do hardly anything now. They can trust in the grace of God and they don't have to worry about living a life beyond what they want to live. And yet Paul talks very clearly that if they decided to live their life that way, if they decided not to run the race as they should, they could become disqualified. Paul even said that he could become disqualified. Considering the mentality of these Corinthian believers, I wondered how Paul's use of that word affected them. I wonder how shocking it may have seemed to them. I have a feeling many of them were asking this question. I'm running in a race that I can't lose, so why should I run at all? You see, there's a prodigal principle here. Some people say, I'm saved, therefore I'm free. Since I'm free, I can run my own race according to my own terms because I don't have to be worried about being saved anymore. Well, I believe this to be the mentality of many who originally received Paul's letter in Corinth. And unfortunately, I believe that it's also the mentality of many people of faith today. I have grown to reject legalism. I reject it mainly because it represents the very nature that I used to live and I'm trying to escape. Legalism, simply put, is the process of trying to be saved based on one's ability to do enough right things. It listens to God's word and it tries to live out God's word in perfection. Such a religious approach, though, breeds, I believe, two things that are horribly detestable. One is it breeds within a person pride in one's own ability to be right. If a person can do more and more right things, it becomes a badge of honor for them. And it can also become a measuring stick that they use as they compare themselves to other people. The second deplorable thing is this: frustration in one's ability to be right is bred because of legalism. It's a loathsome thing to want to be right and to regularly fail. Paul describes that in Romans chapter 7, and he calls himself a wretched man because of his constant failure in trying to live that way. Paul clearly addresses the ineffectiveness of this kind of approach in one's spiritual life by telling the Galatians in Galatians chapter 5 verse 4, "You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace." Shocking words. Legalism is a horrible approach to Christianity. In reaction to this, however, the pendulum can swing too far into the other direction, I believe. Since we can't justify ourselves through our own right living, some will say, let's just accept the grace of God and not worry about all the other details of life. After all, if I don't have to worry about whether I'm doing enough right things to qualify myself for salvation, then my salvation is not based on me doing right things. It's this belief, I think, that Paul uses, that elicits Paul's use of this word disqualified in 1 Corinthians 9. Why run in a race if I can't lose? I can live my life the way that I want. You know, there are a lot of places I can go to explore the answer to this question, but I'd like to go back to something Jesus said, a story that Jesus told in Luke chapter 15, the whole chapter. I believe that Luke chapter 15 is one parable, but told in three different ways. In Luke 15, verses 3 through 7, Jesus talks about a sheep that stupidly wanders away from the flock, and the good shepherd protects the rest of the flock, the 99, and then he goes out to look for the sheep that has wandered away. He finds the sheep, he brings it back, and he asks everyone to rejoice with him that the sheep has been found. He has given value to the one so that he will go after the one and bring him back. In Luke 15, verses 8 through 10, he talks about a woman who carelessly loses a coin, which was most likely a part of her wedding dowry. If she didn't find the coin, there would be great penalties to her reputation, to her social standing. It might also keep her from being able to get married. She sweeps, she finds the coin, she asks everyone to come and to rejoice with her because she has found this precious thing that she has lost. She has such high value for the coin that she looks and looks for the coin and finally finds it. These first two stories in this parable reflect the idea of God's grace that so many people embrace today and do so with great accuracy. God loves those who are his. God will save those who are even stupid or just plain unconscious. And that's true. But there's a third story in this parable. And this story is a famous story that we call the prodigal son. And in the story of the prodigal son, we see a dynamic that I believe Paul is addressing as he writes to the Corinthians. Let's read it together. Luke chapter 15, beginning in verse 11. Jesus continued with this parable, and he says, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country. He began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to be a citizen of that country. Or to a citizen of that country, rather, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. By the way, for a Jewish mindset, to be around pigs that are unclean is detestable. To have to feed the pigs is horrible. But what he did next is the most deplorable thing of all. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. But no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.'" So he got up, went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer to be worthy to be called your son." I want you to notice that the father didn't even acknowledge what the son said. The father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. What just happened here? We have the son who never stopped being the son, who was always the son, who was always welcome to celebrate and enjoy the Father's blessings at his table. But he rebels and he rejects his Father. The son goes his own way. He takes his part of the inheritance. He goes and squanders his part of the estate. And in squandering his part of the estate, he is left with nothing, with no way to reclaim his life. And so he tries to do things on his own. And he tries to find his own way. But all he is met with is uncleanness and frustration and the inability to enjoy his father's blessings. So he decides he wants to go back to his father, and he has this big spiel rehearsed. And yet when the father sees him, he runs to him and he pulls him into his life and he sets him at the table and he gives him his finest because of the relationship that they have. I know the son eventually returns, and some will say, "Well, see, he was never lost." But what if the son had died in the pig pen? If so, I don't believe that the son would have ever known the blessings that were already his if he would have just given up his selfish ways and simply returned to his father. I want you to hear me clearly. The son never lost his place at the table, but he would have lost everything if he had never returned home. He never lost his status as a son, but he would have never known the blessings of being the son if he hadn't returned to his father's arms. So when Paul writes to the Corinthians and he says, "Run the race so as to win, or you will be disqualified," I believe that he understood the principle that Jesus is trying to share in the story of the prodigal son. You can't just claim salvation and then run around believing that you're in God's grace when you're rejecting everything the Father is offering you. You can't enjoy the blessings of the son or the daughter unless you're living in the house of God. And if you live in God's home, you need to learn to act like one of his sons or daughters. That means you take on God's nature. That means you become like God's character. That means you do God's work. Some would say, well, if a person doesn't show the character of God, if they don't choose to pursue God, they were never really sincere about pursuing God. Therefore, they were never saved in the first place. Well, that's, I believe, doing some biblical gymnastics. Some would say, myself included, that a person can be sincere about seeking God's salvation, but can reject him later and lose their salvation. I believe the scriptures teach that. But regardless of where you fall in this discussion, regardless of whether you're on one side or the other of this debate, I believe there's a truth that we can both agree on. God saves his people, and he saves them to do his will. He saves them to act like his children. He saves them so that they can become his hands, his feet, his blessings in the world that desperately needs to know him, to know his name, to know who he stands for, or know who we stand for, and to know what he can do in their lives. Paul sums it up when he says in Colossians 3:17, and whatever you do, in word or in deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. When we say to God, I want you to save me from myself and from the world, he will gracefully do so. But that's only the beginning. If you are saved, you've been saved for a purpose. You've been saved so that you can give your very life to him. We can't live our lives looking for ways to simply get by, to get close, to do just enough. And we're not glorifying God when we're just trying to do the spiritual minimum. The work of God is noble and good. And the gifting that God gives to us sets us aside for God's work, sanctifies us, so that he can use us to glorify his name. And glorifying the name of Jesus is the most wonderful thing that we can do with our life, because it's a blessing to so many. There are many people who do not know the blessings of Jesus. There are many people who do not know the good news of the death and the burial and the resurrection and what it can mean in their lives. There are many people who have a struggle in their lives because they have been rejecting God. They've been pushing God away, and we can show them how to have God draw near to them. There are many who don't know God's answer for hunger and war and strife. We can't live our lives as selfish Christians who only look out for ourselves just because we have some warped meaning of what God's grace is. We cannot leave the principle out of our lives that God saved us in his grace so that we could become grace to others. So if you're going to run this race by training and acting like you want to win the race that you're in. You need to get into it all the way. And only then will you begin to understand the true blessings of what it means to run with God. Pray with me. Lord, there are a lot of Christians who claim your grace but don't act like you want them to. There's a lot of Christians who have trusted in your salvation, but yet they don't humble themselves to your service. Help us to run the race like we want to win the race. Help us to be who you've called us to be. Help us to embrace the gifts that you give to us. Help us to interact with the world so that we can be the light and the leaven and the hope and the giving that you want to give to the world. Help us not to be afraid to throw ourselves fully in. Because, Lord, this is a race that's worth winning. And we're grateful to have been chosen to be a part of it. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much for being a part of this tonight. Come see us at the Salisaw Church of Christ in Salisaw, Oklahoma at 10:30 this coming Sunday morning, 1104 Choctaw. We'd love to worship with you. If you can't be there, tune into our live stream on the YouTube channel at 10:30. God's blessings to you all. Have a great week in the Lord, and I'll see you next Wednesday night in our Zoom Bible class.